Hi everyone, it's my great privilege to start this conference off with the first talk of the first day. And whilst we're meeting in a reduced capacity, quite unlike that of the last meeting that I had the great privilege to attend in Stellenbosch, I hope we can still have the same sort of conversations and that same atmosphere can still emerge through this meeting as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. In the academic year of 2019 to 2020, I undertook a postgraduate study of the Pilgrim community's time, stretching from 1609 to 1620 in the Dutch city of Leiden, supported by Leiden University and the unaffiliated Congregational Churches Charities, UCCC for short, in the UK. This morning or evening, wherever you are, it is my daunting task to give an overview of the Pilgrims' story from their time in and around the English village of Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, to the Dutch city of Leiden, and further on to America, where the other talks will take from there. In short, I have been asked to lay out the experiences of the Pilgrims, their decision-making, the main theological questions which brood, and the social identities and attitudes of the religious group, before they eventually stepped foot on the sea-sprayed deck of the Mayflower, that small ship which took the Pilgrim community from the Dutch United Provinces to Virginia. Because of the scale of this task, you'll be pleased to know I've streamlined this story for a retelling of accounts before Pilgrims: William Bradford, William Brewster, John Robinson, and Sarah Willett Minter. Some are well known, some are less well known, but all exemplify the Pilgrims as a group and hold interesting stories in their own right, which in turn highlight some of the complexities and inner conflicts these religious emigres struggled with. To present an initial picture, the Pilgrims stood among a melting pot of reformed groups while in Leiden. Among the narrow cobbled streets of Leiden, bordered by quintessential Dutch canals, French Walloon churches gathered for worship, accounting for almost 15% of the city's population. Mennonites, the English Reformed Church, and the Dutch Reformed Church all operated in the city at the same time as the Pilgrims. Russian and North African scholars came to the university to study under the tutelage of the staff present. The Pilgrims were not, by my own researchers' reckoning, a particularly cohesive group when in the Netherlands, meaning that they did not keep their distance from these other sects, but communicated and blended with them, forming new connections and new traditions as they spent more and more time in the city. Ironically, after having been asked to speak about the Pilgrims in England and the Netherlands, our discussion inevitably begins with the United States, quite befitting of this conference that would have been hosted by our American partners near Boston. In the May of 1867, the Massachusetts House of Representatives sat to see an exchange of international goodwill between Britain and America. What they were watching was a formal repatriation of the William Bradford manuscript history, the manuscript we now refer to as of Plymouth Plantation. It was a document which one state senator described as the most precious manuscript on earth, unless we could recover one of the four Gospels. Bradford's work remains the cornerstone of any history of the Pilgrims, his voice elevated above all others. How the manuscript fell into English hands remains a mystery, with many scholars believing that it had been incinerated in 1765 in a fire of the governor's mansion, or lost during the fleeing of Boston during the War of Independence. Alan Howard, an academic on Bradford, writes, "As America's first great work of literature, Plymouth Plantation must surely be the most important work of the 17th century. It must be considered a minor irony, then, that the history has been used so extensively and yet so uncritically. A Plymouth Plantation is seen to be so important to the Pilgrims that it is taken as gospel. What Bradford wrote was not a new gospel, however, but instead a series of stylized answers to the arising situations which confronted the Pilgrims as they formed a new life for themselves. Despite that, it remains the best place to start our discussion. From our text, we know that Bradford was a young man from Austerfield and was orphaned at a young age. He remained dissatisfied with his Anglican congregation and instead made the treacherous journey each Sunday to an adjacent village, the principal hub of separatism named Scrooby. There he saw a community which was hard pressed by the government, tilling the land and rearing livestock under the constant weight of possible imprisonment from their oppressor, King James I. In Bradford's words, James I hunted and persecuted them on every side, so as their former afflictions were but as flea-bitings in comparison. That said, he also saw a community which did not burden Scripture with human intentions, but took it simply at its word in an unadorned way. Bradford would later compare them to the Israelites, sailing to the aforementioned promised land of North America under God's own providence. Pushed out by the suppression to the Netherlands, an understandable migration from home after all, when home appears as dangerous as the mouth of a shark. The Pilgrim's journey across the narrow stretch of sea was not without difficulty. Bradford writes that upon hearing of the Pilgrims' efforts to flee, officials shut the nearby ports. With clandestine operations and agreements had to be struck in absence of other ways to travel. Their first attempt to flee a year before their successful migration eventually, setting off from Boston and Lincolnshire, failed when one mariner ransacked their belongings, searching them to their shirts for money. 7 of the hopeful fleers were sent to the nearby Assessor's Court and paraded through the town in humiliation. One of them was Bradford, who would be detained in Boston for months alongside one of our other characters, William Brewster, a much older man compared to Bradford. He was born in Scrooby in the 1590s and had lent his large house and grounds to the separatists for gatherings. He would later become known as the force behind the Pilgrims' press, distributing pamphlets against the English crown from Leyden. Bradford, though, almost embarrassed of this failure that the Pilgrims had to flee, pleased that we don't remember this stuttering nature of the Pilgrims fleeing, in favour of a narrative that makes the group appear more streetwise, the early modern equivalent of those in The Great Escape, perhaps. In reality, obstacles presented themselves at every turn. The Pilgrims' second attempt in 1608 was no less arduous. Those imprisoned in Boston were finally freed before joining the rest of the community. The men of the church walked across the marshy uplands to the coast, somewhere between Grimsby and Hull, while the women and children took a barge by night. Upon arrival, a great company of officials with guns and other weapons were made out in hot pursuit from over the beach dunes, causing the captain of the vessel to lift his anchor early, leaving women and children stranded on the sands. Bradford writes of children left quaking in the sea air and mothers left weeping. For those on the boat, life was no easier. Faced with tremendous storms, they almost ended up stranded off the coast of Norway, with even the mariners despairing for their lives. Thankfully, the families caught near Hull were released and reunited with the rest of the Pilgrim group in Amsterdam. On the outside baptistery wall of Leiden's impressive Peterskirk, which rises above the town's countless rows of handsome brick houses, is a bronze tablet from 1891. It is decorated with a relief of the Mayflower, a passage of remembrance from the American National Council of Congregational Churches, and the name of John Robinson, the pastor to the Pilgrims. A crop failure in 1607 had wreaked havoc across England. Many thought this to be divine retribution for the nation not fully reforming to Protestantism like the Low Countries and Germany. Robertson thought differently. He was critical of the established church, but saw the spirit working in his Anglican parish of St Andrews in Norwich. However, this feeling began to change, turning Robinson from a reformer within a governmentally sanctioned space to a rebel. In 1604, it was decreed in the Anglican Church that the Book of Common Prayer was to be mandatory, re-emphasizing past controversies over the influences of the bishops in the day-to-day life of the church. Rejecting this, Robinson became a black sheep within his own tradition, and needless to say, his resistance was met with hostility and he was removed from his position. Helped by local contacts, Robinson remained in Norwich for the next 3 years and even applied to become a preacher at the city's great hospital, who, like the church, had little time for his dissenting views. With no other choice, he ventured back to the home that he once had, called Sturton-le-Steeple, another village in the area of Austerfield and Scrooby, joining the separatist group led by Richard Clifton and William Brewster. Even after being removed from St Andrews, he did not immediately think of dissenting, yet now found himself in the wellspring of a new radical ideology. What occurred in Robinson's case was a tepid break, fueled by long and painful considerations. All the while, the situation grew more draconian and dangerous for the Pilgrims, with Richard Bancroft becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, enforcing conformity within the church with a heavier and blunter hand. Holland, by contrast, appeared open for business, both socially and economically, to those who opposed the state church, willing to engage anyone from anywhere about anything. The Dutch revolt of the 1570s and subsequent independence from Spain had caused a distinctly open character to emerge. In not a dissimilar way as today, people gathered underneath pub signs and in the alcoves of the university cloisters, sheltering from the rain. Conversation filled the canal-lined streets which intersected through the fortified cities. A distinct level of religious tolerance was present, something the Netherlands has long since rooted in their national history. In turn, the Dutch provinces became the obvious place for the Pilgrims, whom at this point were only thinking of temporary sanctuary. Was Holland truly the anvil upon which religious and civil liberty was beaten out in Europe when it was scarcely heard elsewhere? That remains debated by historians. It seems that the toleration of the Pilgrims was more about a willingness to trade and gain from them commercially. Leiden was clean and well organised, with a fledgling government. Guardsmen patrolled the bridges to ensure nobody dumped waste into the River Rhine, which runs through the city to this day. Despite this cleanliness, it was also a place marked by noticeable travesty and shared suffering. The siege of Leiden at the hands of the Spanish during the Dutch revolt some 30 years earlier had resulted in half the city's population dying of starvation. At that time, a local burgomaster named Van der Werf was said to have imitated Christ and offered his body as sustenance for the people to eat. Thankfully, in his case, the townspeople did not partake, but a local park was still named after him, and various paintings of Van der Werf outstretch and adorn the walls of Dutch galleries. Despite the city recovering well from this time, the population remained low, and consequently the city embarked on a policy of migration. This was another reason for such religious tolerance. Bradford, though, was disorientated by the fast-moving country, seemingly without rules, as were many of the other pilgrims. In the early modern period, merchants had long been thought of as deceitful. They spoke in hidden words, hushed tones, they used secret signs, and hard to gain terminology. For Bradfords, the trades and traffics of Holland spelled confusion and danger. You can easily imagine that the Pilgrims felt an even greater cultural shock when arriving in North America, upon seeing the indigenous peoples already present in this seemingly unpeopled land, unaware of the travesties that would befall them at the hands of the generations of migrants to come. Coincidentally, to go on a brief tangent, even in their colony of New Plymouth, the Pilgrims could not escape this Dutch confusion, with the short-lived but powerful holdings of New Nederland and New Amsterdam, which would eventually become New York, operating further up the coast. Years later, Bradford would write of the Pilgrim experiences in excessively plain language, hoping that his voice would cut through this babble of confusion. He presented an image of the Pilgrims as those used to a plain country life and innocent trades of husbandry, that they were governed by honest and direct forms of behaviour, unlike the Dutch. Despite many of them being artisans, and in Brewster's case, traders themselves. The town officials of Leiden were welcoming, if a tad demanding. On the 12th of February 1609, the Pilgrims were granted free entry to come live in the city, as long as they behaved honestly and obeyed all the laws and ordinances. Under those conditions, the applicant's arrival here would be pleasing and welcome, the magistrates outlined. Upon hearing that the Pilgrims had gained sanctuary in Leiden, James I was incensed, and he wrote to the city officials. The group was not radical Brownists, they replied. They weren't a radical group, and that Leiden informed the English crown that the city had merely given free and unrestrained ingress for a small group of worshipping Christians under the leadership of their pastor, John Robinson. They assured James I that they had no knowledge that giving help to such a group would have caused offence. Such excuses infuriated the king, and he kept close tabs on events in Leiden and the Dutch Republic. Over the years in which the Pilgrims stayed in Leiden, James only grew more resentful. The fact that the first tobacco sellers in the city were Pilgrims, a habit that James I openly abhorred, probably served to antagonise him even further. John Robinson did not take long to discover that, although they were hospitable, the Dutch were only interested in sponsoring the activities of the English Reformed Church, the ERC, an offshoot of the National Dutch Reformed Church, and sanctioned by the state. The separatists instead were left without status, defined merely as a vergadering, a religious gathering. They gathered at Robinson's home, as the persecuted churches had gathered at homes of their worshippers. The house was bought along with 3 other pilgrims and nicknamed Groene Point, the Green Door. Behind it, 14 smaller houses were built back to back, usually with 2 identical sized rooms measuring 8 feet by 12 feet, space enough for a loom and a stove, but not much else. 2/3 of the pilgrim community lived around the same square the Green Door sat on, away from the epicenter of the new town, which was being built in Leiden and dubbed the Ants' Nest due to its problems with overcrowding. The same square today is in the shadow of the Pieterskirk, where Robinson's plaque now hangs. Relationships with the city magistrates remained placid and calm, out of fear that the Dutch would give them up to King James, and in Bradford's words, the separatist community did achieve against all the odds a degree of peace and spiritual comfort. The single-heartedness and affection among the community attracted others to the band of dissidents, with Edward Winslow and other pilgrims joining the fellowship. Winslow only planned on staying in Holland briefly for work, yet remained with the pilgrims and eventually set off for a new life on the Mayflower. Another individual who belongs to this community that gathered with the pilgrims was Sarah Willett Minter. Born in Norwich, not far from Robinson's later parish of St Andrews, she had only heard hearsay about the Dutch Republic. She worried, like the other pilgrims, male and female, about how to cope with a new language and an altogether new place. She worried that the area that she would now call home, however briefly, was prone to war and hunger. The grim and grisly face of poverty was clear, regardless of how much wealth the merchants accumulated. Destitution came upon the pilgrim community like an armed man, Bradford writes, and she, like the rest of the group, needed work. Much like our world today of inequality and varying economic fortunes, the Pilgrims, while supportive of each other, did not face this financial trouble as a solid unit. William Brewster made a living by tutoring foreign students and by trading, whilst the Dutch Republic bewildered some of the English pilgrims, seeing the trades and traffics of Holland as confusing. Brewster actively engaged with the mercantile networks of Leiden. He was a respected trader before fleeing England, and his fortunes were helped by his reputation as assistant to William Davison, Secretary of State for Elizabeth I. Brewster had even helped negotiate the appointment of the Earl of Leicester to be Governor General of the United Provinces after the assassination of William of Orange in Delft in 1584. He was a distinct breed of pilgrim then, wealthy and of high standing, not far away from those in Elizabeth's court like Walter Raleigh. In an attempt not to present an overly glowing and misleading depiction of the Pilgrims, whose legacies continue to be embroiled in dark moments of colonial and territorial history, Brewster's story holds a caveat. The historian Jeremy Bangs, now the curator of the Leiden American Pilgrim Museum, states that he stands out as a likely exploiter of child labor in sweatshop conditions. Worse still, his children were the offspring of his fellow pilgrims. A Plymouth plantation provides a clear basis that the children of separatists worked longer and tougher hours than their parents. Bradford writes, for many of their children, willing to bear part of their parents' burden, were so oppressed with their heavy labours that their bodies bowed under the weight of the same. That said, Bruce's own life was not without hardship. Almost as soon as the religious group arrived in Leiden, he buried a child near the Hoogslander Kirk in the city centre. Bradford also suggests that Brewster, despite his significant influence and wealth, lived in dreary conditions for a time along the Stinksteeg, a byword in Dutch town planning for any street which was set aside as a public urinal for those leaving nearby pubs after last orders. Comically, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants erected a plaque there in 1955 without realising the street's true significance, and not on Ursula's Lane, where Brewster moved and lived for the majority of his time in Leiden. Perhaps inevitably, the Netherlands and the Pilgrims became drawn into religious conflict. Put simply, as not to dwell on dense theology for too long, contestations between Arminius, who is buried in the same church where Robinson's plaque hangs, and Gemarius, who were two theologians at Leiden University, fashioned a deep rift in the Dutch Calvinist church. Arminians, also known as Remonstrants, saw the merging of church and government as positive, and previous ideas of predestination, the notion that God had predetermined who will reach heaven, as no longer true or holding weight. Gemarians, also known as contra-remonstrants, on the other hand, disagreed with all of this. Robinson, a strict Calvinist himself, took it upon himself to join this fight against the Arminians, who appear in his writings as adversaries and crooked men. The Synod of Dort in 1618 to 1619 was the culmination of these hostilities between these strained camps. It was convened as a big meeting, much like the ICF conference, to promote unity in the wider church. But what occurred instead was a direct attack on the Arminians, with many being put on trial, captured and killed. How does this relate to the Pilgrim story? Well, not to miss an opportunity, King James used these divisions to make inroads into the Netherlands, giving privileges to Prince Maurits of Nassau and welcoming into his personal garter. Maurits would later violently remove the Arminians from Leiden, and laws that were enacted against the Arminians also impacted the Pilgrims as well. Things about banning public worship. Whilst all this was playing out, Sarah Willett Minter had found work. Although not much is known, her life can be pieced together from a few city records, becoming the principal midwife to the Pilgrims. One of her roles was presenting newborn children to the church, and through this, she gained influence and notoriety in the community. The practice of welcoming an infant into the church was one of many things which changed after the Pilgrims broke away from the Church of England. They no longer shook salt over the baby. They no longer rubbed oil into their skin, and they no longer cast warnings against Satan over the infant's head. Despite this role, she continued to struggle without much financial help. Her Dutch counterpart, Barbara van der Beek, aiding mothers in the Dutch Reformed Church, received the assistance of doctors when medical trouble arose and was highly paid. Willett Minter instead depended on the generosity of strangers. If they were known to be of the Pilgrim congregation, Bradford writes, the Dutch, either bakers or others, would trust them when they wanted money. In 1618, she was widowed and forced to marry for a third time. Some time later, Willett Minter became unable to support her eldest child, Desire Minter, turning to John and Catherine Carver to rear her, and the generosity of Thomas Brewer, a printer who worked with William Brewster, for a regular stipend towards her future. As tensions grew in Holland, Brewster made full use of his connections to the university. In 1617, a tract named Perth Assembly was printed, speculating that King James planned to reintroduce episcopal forms of governance in Scotland, something that was deeply unpopular. A manhunt for the printers began. The English ambassador at The Hague, Dudley Carleton, became the Crown's key figure in halting the printing of anything deemed slanderous. In the wake of the incident, a decree was issued banning the publication of books, songs, and news reports which were seen to be against King James. Names of authors and translators had to be clearly shown, as well as the location of the printing office. When attention fell on Leiden, the university came together and drew up plans to protect their printers. They were now directly facing off against the most powerful monarch in Europe. Months after the work had been published, it was reported by one of James's aides that Brewster had been captured. This was retracted only 2 days later, where Carleton received a rather embarrassing apology that Brewster was taken at Leiden, which proved to be an error, in that the scout, being a dull and drunken fellow, took one man for another. When the real Brewster was found, the university stepped in. He was detained, but as a tutor was not subject to ordinary courts. And days later, he managed to escape, his students creating enough of a stir for him to sneak away. You can picture it now, tens of young men dressed in black robes shouting and jumping outside the university in the face of officials, whilst Brewster ran down a dark alleyway to safety. Some historians believe that the assistance did not end there. Brewster exercised a series of patronyms in the months afterwards, one comically being Master William Williamson. It was almost as if someone had drawn him a fake ID and provided him assistance. He remained in the Netherlands for a few months, leaving only one record from a payment dispute involving Brewster buying 6 guilders and 10 stalvers of wine on credit. He would finally set sail and arrive in Virginia only a few months after the Mayflower. That Brewster was allowed to escape is almost certainly due to the protective collusion by the Leiden government, Bangs suggests. The Pilgrims were not always bent on sailing to Virginia, though, and for a time, Guyana, due to the reports of the adventurous Sir Walter Raleigh, and the Dutch New Netherlands looked surer bets. Robinson even proposed that his sons study in the Netherlands and learn Dutch, so to gain a firm footing in this new part of the North American colonies. That said, even Robinson could not predict the procession of events. Staying with the majority of the pilgrims in Leiden, despite his own inhibitions, he held off boarding the Mayflower. In the late June of 1620, the pilgrims left via the nearby estuary of Delfshaven. Waving them off, Robinson is depicted by Bradford as falling onto his knees and pounding the coarse sand near the water's edge, lamenting that he could not go with his congregation. His absence was felt, and in 1621, James Shirley, a plantation worker and friend of the separatists, wrote from Plymouth, "We have some amongst us with undoubtedly aim more at their own private ends. An absence of moral leadership could be felt. Some of those who came on the Anne, a ship that followed the Mayflower 3 years later, carrying more of the Leiden community to the now growing community at Plymouth, thought very much the same. Without Robinson, the work in progress plantation seemed wanting of the sacraments. In 1625, Robinson passed away, to great anguish from those in Plymouth and in Leiden. Pilgrim Winslow writes that after Robinson's death, the university and ministers of the city accompanied him to his grave with all their accustomed solemnities, bewailing the great loss. Some of the chief of them sadly affirmed that all of the churches of Christ sustained a loss by the death of that worthy instrument of the gospel. There was another notable absence on the Mayflower, and the Speedwell, another accompanying ship that ran aground in Southampton before making it to Virginia. It was decided that the young and the strong would be the first to prosper in these new lands and the first to go. Desire Minter, along with the Carvers, proved ideal candidates. However, Sarah Willett Minter remained in the city, aware of the risks of the boat capsizing, as had been the case with other separatists overcrowding similar vessels in the years previous. They left the goodly and pleasant city, which had been their resting place for nearly 12 years. Desire Minter would, in the years after, return to England, but whether she ever saw her mother again is lost to history. It's my hope that this overview of the lives of 4 pilgrims has provided a personal and representative history of the religious group's time in England and Leiden. Just as the religious emigres became adept at navigating Dutch cities' babble of confusion, we can see that their fortunes swiftly changed at the whims of politics and war. Through these stories, certain factors are identifiable. New laws against worship and the dissemination of knowledge, financial hardship, and potential religious and political conflict are all part of the story. There was no giddiness in their decision to set sail from England and then from the Netherlands to Virginia, but a sworn duty and to a degree a lack of choice. They had been made members of a religious diaspora. Bradford was right to say that there were weighty and solid reasons for their sailing on the now folkloric Mayflower.